So the big question really is how evolution influences behavior. How could it have shaped the human mind and behavior that we have today? And evolutionary psychology is kind of the approach that asks whether human mental processes and behaviors could actually be understood better in terms of survival and or reproductive advantages from human ancestors. So we can think about various behaviors as adaptations. So for example, the behaviors of animals are likely to be adaptations. An example of this is newborn geese who imprint on the first moving thing they see. So even if that moving thing is a person or some other animal, the first thing they see that moves, they sort of pay attention to and they follow. Now, typically, the first thing they see moving is the parent. However, that's not always the case. You can actually imprint a goose yourself by being the first thing it sees, and it will follow you around. Now, this sort of behavior, of course, is a genetic kind of thing. It happens right immediately after they hatch, but because it helps the young stay close to the parents without having to be carried. So as a result, you can have lots of offspring, and they'll follow you around. You don't have to be responsible for carrying these offspring if you are a goose. Evolutionary psychologists are interested in evolutionary origins of human and social behavior. Even this is kind of a social behavior, right? The chicks are following, or the goslings, I guess, are following the goose immediately after they're hatched, but it's a social behavior. More than almost any other species, humans rely on each other for basic survival needs. And it's one of the reasons our human social structure is so complex, and many aspects of behavior are thought to be adaptations in the social world. If you think about how humans have been successful in the world, it's not because we're big or strong or fast or anything of that sort. In fact, compared to a lot of the predators in the world, we're certainly none of those things. What has enabled us to survive has been kind of our ability to work with each other, and especially in things like teams and social groups, and our ability to be smart. And those things, as a result, suggest that the brain and social structures and social behavior really came about by adaptations or evolutionary sort of abilities. Here's an example of that, the notion of altruism as an adaptation. So early attempts to understand human behavior as an adaptation typically focused on this thing called altruism. That is, sacrificing yourself to help another person. Now, it's not the same thing as cooperation or helpfulness, which you get something out of. Instead, it's a situation where you actually put yourself in harm's way for somebody else. And at first, this seems like a really bad candidate for an adaptation, right? According to adaptations, they should enable you to do things like live longer and reproduce more. However, this can also still, being altruistic, being good to somebody else, even if it's puts you at harm, can help you pass on your genes. The person who talked about this originally was a fellow named E.O. Wilson. He studied bees, actually. He noted that bees and ants who are closely related would often sacrifice themselves to save relatives. He proposed the notion of inclusive fitness. That is, an individual's genetic contribution is determined not only by his or her own offspring, but also the offspring of genetic relatives. So you might put yourself in harm's way more for a brother or a sister or a nephew or a niece or something than you would a stranger. And you would do that, at least E.O. Wilson suggested, largely because of situations like inclusive fitness, where your genes, because they're also present to some degree in those blood relatives, would likely get passed on. And in fact, evidence suggests that humans are more likely to make life-threatening sacrifices for their close kin than they are for others, although it matters probably a little less for day-to-day cooperation. So Wilson suggested that smaller sacrifices for non-kin might also be adaptive. So throughout history, As you can imagine, sometimes food and resources become scarce due to drought or any number of other things. If in this situation you happen to help somebody else who is in your tribe in need one day, they might in turn help you in the future when you are in need. And this is referred to as reciprocal altruism. In both cases, thinking of altruism as an adaptation tended to help researchers predict it better, understanding when people would make sacrifices for others and when they would not. Also related to this, in terms of our behavior and sort of the propagation of our genes, is the notion of sexual selection. So mating itself is strongly shaped by evolution. So if you look at non-human animals, all other animals, basically, evolutionary psychologists have studied sexual selection and looked at the impact of that on the traits that help individuals compete for mates. So they tend to distinguish between two processes. One is called intrasexual selection, that is within the same sex. Individuals of the same sex compete with each other for mates, and characteristics that help individuals win these competitions would be selected. So this is basically a way of making sure that you have an opportunity to mate and sort of propagate your genes and so forth, and competing with people of the same sex as you for opportunities to mate. Then there's intersexual or between sex selection. These are characteristics that attract potential mates, like a bright tail of a healthy male peacock that would be selected. And it turns out that humans engage in behaviors that seem to do both of these things. An example of that is kind of a display of skill, for example, in any number of things, but on a football field, in the music room, any number of places where you have an opportunity to sort of show off, you can think of as engaging in intersexual selection. So here's an example of intrasexual selection, where you're butting heads against each other or antlers against each other to sort of determine who's most dominant, and whoever is least dominant sort of steps down and removes themselves from the picture. Then there's intersexual selection. So again, these are things like the male peacock showing off his feathers, even though when you think about it, in some ways that's a terrible evolutionary idea. So these bright displays make that peacock just, perfect pickings for any predator that would want to come along and eat him. But it turns out that it helps him recreate more often, and as a result, it's well worth the additional sort of possibility of becoming prey. And then, of course, as we described down here, sort of this display of skill situation where this tends to also increase things like sexual reproduction.